This conference will now be recorded.
Oh, that's very authoritarian. So I'm now recording the session just so that everybody is aware of that. So I'm going to go on the idea that you can all hear and see me, so I'm going to start. As I said, I'll unmute you near the end. If you've got any questions, you're absolutely welcome to ask them, or of course you can always email me afterwards. When this session is over, I'm going to send you a really quick online survey. It's literally one question in which we ask you to re-rate how confident you are in this topic. And once you've completed that, I will send you the slides. So don't feel the need to scribble down furiously, because I will be sending you everything that we're going to cover today. And so hopefully you all are aware that you're at this webinar, which is an introduction to funding core costs. So in today's session, we will be covering what are core costs, the challenges of fundraising for core costs, and we're going to look a little bit at what the challenges for funders, grant funders, are around them funding core costs as well. Looking at making sure we've got everything in place to start trying to fundraise for core costs, looking at how we can cover grants, how we can use grants to cover our core costs, and then looking at some other different fundraising methods as well. So I will just go straight into it. So just so that everyone's on the same page, there's loads of different definitions of what core costs are. Oh, hang on. By the way, I'm Vicky. I'm the membership manager, membership and engagement manager here at Consortium. I think most of you have met me, but just so you know who I am, that's probably a better way to start. So going back to definitions, there's no really one definition of what we call core costs. There are a couple, but I've just kind of put the basics here. So when I'm referring to core costs, I'm referring to the cost of running your organisation or group and to keeping it going in general. So that can also be called overheads or running costs. And these costs are opposed to the specific direct costs of your project or your service delivery. So they are things like office rental or desk space hire, utility bills, IT, phone bills, legal, accountancy, staff that we call kind of like core staff, so the ones that aren't directly related to projects. That could be admin or finance, or in fact your CEO. If you haven't got staff, it could just be any number of the other things. It could be around training your trustees or covering their expenses or running your AGM. It could be fundraising or the membership, if you have a membership. So there's loads and loads of different things that are covered in core costs, and we're going to have a look at how we can be a bit clever about fundraising for some of those today. Organisations that have good, secure core costs tend to be more confident, more engaged in statutory consultations and service redesign, developing strategic relationships that can often lead to further funding, expanding services into new areas, and establishing new partnerships. And that's mainly because actually you tend not to be, we call it firefighting at Consortium, all the time. So you're not trying to cover everything and be all things to all people. When you've got the good running costs and the kind of back office stuff in place, it makes everything run more smoothly. For example, we were really lucky to be given a piece of funding so that we could use a CRM, client relationship management tool, which we just couldn't ever fund before, although we are a membership organisation and really needed it. And we got given the money for that, and it's changed the way we work. It means that we can run data, we can see trends, which means we're more responsive to our members' needs. So it's really had a big impact on the service delivery and allowed us to kind of develop the areas of support that we offer a lot more. So that secure kind of back office stuff really has an impact on the wider organisation. In general, 10 to 20% of a group's total expenditure goes on core costs. That is for UK organisations. Interestingly, international development charities tend to operate at 30% plus. So actually in the UK, certainly within our sector, it's a little bit lower than overseas. Those costs might actually be higher if a group is new, or if they're growing or rapidly expanding, or if indeed they're working towards an ambitious vision and they might have to bring in staff to project manage or do whatever, but that's not related to a specific project. Funders usually check grant funders usually check any applicant's accounts for overhead costs, even if they're not being funded or applying for that specific aspect of your work. So you do need to be prepared to explain what your core costs are, how they're calculated, and if they are quite high, why that is the case. It doesn't always mean that if they are high, people will just say, no, we're not funding you, as long as you can back up why that is in fact the case. So now that we're all clear about what our core costs are, let's look at just briefly some of the challenges for us in funding that. So I expect will all have put some sort of applications in for projects at some point. So we know that project costs are way easier to fund than core costs. And that's a lot of the time because I think grant funders in particular know that that is a project that's bound up in its own outcomes. So by the end of the funding, they will have clear change that's been affected by the work that they've funded. For us as charities and community groups, it's a lot easier to bundle those things up and apply for them. Lots of funders want to fund project costs. Not so many want to fund core costs, unfortunately. And as a result of that, most of our members, and I think most charities and community groups, feel that their core functions are under-resourced and that actually we have to kind of move things around, kind of make do. 50% of our members, when we asked them of the members that responded to our annual survey, listed finding funding for core costs as their biggest challenge going forward in 2020. And that's increasing. We ask that every year, and more members are finding that challenging. Also, when it comes to core costs, we are going to look at this a little bit later on in the session, but it can be really hard to, that's supposed to be attract, not attach, attract donors and general public appeals to funding our core costs rather than specific work that's going on. But actually that can be one way that we do cover our core costs. So from a funder's point of view, they aren't that frequent in funding core costs, although I will actually give you a bit of a list later on of the ones that specifically say they do. And that's because it can be quite hard for not only organisations but for funders who are accountable to others to assess the impact that their grants are having when they fund core costs. So they tend to support the actual cost of delivering those frontline services rather than that kind of back office. And I think that a lot of grant funders are also really concerned that they're going to create this kind of unsustainable dependency on grant funding to fund the core of our work, which means that when their funding runs out, how are we going to continue funding it? I think among funders as well, there's also really an increased emphasis on monitoring and evaluation. And that's true of the voluntary sector's development over the last sort of 10 years as well, which means that we can better track a project's progress and encourage funders to attempt to link their grants to specific outcomes. But some funders really struggle to assess the impact of core funding. And again, in this session, I'm going to have a little look at how we can kind of sell core funding. But many funders want to see as much of their money go into those frontline services, which can be really frustrating for us because, of course, we know that we can't continue to deliver those frontline services without funding our core work and our core function. But the good news is, I think that a lot more funders nowadays are seeing the importance of Funder Plus, which is about providing support on top of grant funding so that groups can become more income diverse through investment in core work. So it's not all bleak, as we will see hopefully by the end of this webinar. There's also, of course, some external challenges to us as charities and community groups funding our core work. There is a public mistrust of voluntary organisations who spend a high proportion of income on administration. And I think that that kind of fuels a lot of funders being a really kind of cautious to give grants that cover overheads rather than project costs. And there is a misconception that spending on core functions is seen as wasting money because it isn't going to that direct delivery. So there's pressure on organisations to really keep core costs down, to kind of like combat that public mistrust or misunderstanding, really. But unfortunately, the consequences of that is that key areas of the voluntary sector, and our sector in particular, such as internal HR systems, computer systems, training, governance, are all left underinvested. And it's more difficult to raise core funds for this kind of work. Often staff end up putting more hours in to ensure that these things run smoothly, and that in turn gives funders a really false impression of how much things actually cost and what is required to run a charity or a community group. It also means that actually the leaders, the community leaders, the CEOs, the paid staff don't have the space and time to develop and grow the organisations to A, become more sustainable, but B, to meet the actual growing need that our communities are expressing that they need. And again, we've kind of always had that make do or do without approach. So actually, we will chip in, we will borrow, beg and steal to make those things happen. And again, that's not necessarily a true impression of how much things cost. So what can we do about that? Certainly Consortium have been working really hard. We've been talking to funders about the importance of that back office functionality. We've been talking to funders about how not everything that's funded should have cold, hard outcomes attached to them. And that certainly when we're working with communities that, well, with LGBT communities, that actually the evidence might not be there to create those outcomes in the first place. So we are really trying to work with funders, and I think that we all, as LGBT charities and community organisations, can have that conversation with funders, even if they funded us in the past but don't want to fund us in future, just really highlighting the need for that. We can also ask for public support towards core costs. We need to change the narrative around how core cost is a waste of money and that it's going in people's pockets. We need to really educate people, the public and funders and donors, on the importance of funding core costs. And when that happens, we really need to publicly thank and celebrate funders and donors who are supporting those costs, because it's so important. I think that there are definitely a range of funders that have recognise that need, and there are some funders which absolutely used to refuse. In fact, the big lottery 10 years ago would never fund core costs, and there were examples, in fact, of people getting their applications back saying, yeah, take that 10% out for a management fee and we'll think about it. But now they've really changed their approach, and that's in response, I think, to groups working with them and really kind of telling them what they need. So we're going to look now at the things we need to put in place before we begin fundraising for our core costs. Oh, there you go, before you begin fundraising. So actually, I think what we need to do is we get into a bit of a rut, we get into a habit. We need to go back and we need to make sure that everything we do and buy and receive is good value for money. Now, I am not encouraging anybody to cut corners or to look at reducing what's probably already a shoestring budget even further. But actually, there's a difference between that and ensuring that we are getting good value for money. So that means that we're actually looking at every item on our expenditure list and seeing if we are actually getting good value for money. A really good example of this is one of our members who had been in the office that they used for like 6-7 years. That's just where they were based. That's when they were employed. That's where they moved into. That's where they were. But actually, a little bit of shopping around meant that they've saved over £3,000 per year just by moving to an office on the other side of town. So actually, just because something's done the way it's done, it doesn't mean it's the best way. It doesn't mean it's the best value for money. Is there anything that you can look at resharing assets? So we've got a project at the moment going on in central London, which looks at a couple of LGBT charities actually pooling some of their resources, sharing office space, looking at kind of buying in things on a larger scale, which saves them money. But on a more basic side of things, I used to be a trustee for a Pride down in the southwest, and actually we were very lucky to get a piece of funding which meant we could have commissioned a massive Pride flag that people could carry down the city centre when they did the parade. And actually other groups started borrowing that and hiring it and just putting, you know, kind of, so it was a really nice way of sharing an asset or something tangible. Searching or negotiating for better deals on the phone or utilities can be really good. We're actually currently looking into whether we can use Microsoft Teams, which we use as a communication tool between colleagues, as to whether we can use that as a phone system, because we were talking to another member the other week that was saying that they've done that and it's you know, saved them a lot of money. I was at a conference the other week and I was talking to some other LGBT consortium members about HR systems online, and we swapped some notes, and actually it turns out that one of the ones that were being used was really great value for money, so a couple of people have moved over to that. So funders like to see that applicants have tried to help themselves and are getting support or good value from elsewhere. So really take some time to just look at what you've got at the moment and how you can kind of really make that better if possible. The other thing that you need to do before you can really start looking into this is knowing your numbers. So do you actually know how much your core costs are? Can you break them down into worst case scenario core costs? Does your annual budget include a detailed breakdown for those core costs and your project costs, or is it all bundled into one? Making sure that you're really aware of these costs help you to really kind of know where you're going to have to look, how much of a challenge you've got to raise, and it can help you to revise them. Or some of your core costs, can they be put into project costs? We'll look at that a little bit later on as well. So get a cup of tea, get your bills, get your invoices, your bank statements from the past year or the past 2 years, and just sit down and kind of spend some time having a look about that. So now I want to talk to you about grant funding, and I put a little picture here on this slide, which is a little unicorn, because sometimes we like to refer to core cost funding grants as unicorn grants, because they are quite few and far between, but they do exist. So what you can do is really look for funders that support core costs. As I say, there aren't many, but there are some. And what you're looking for really, other than core costs, is any grant that will give you unrestricted money. So restricted money tends to be for a specific thing. So project grants are often restricted, but that unrestricted grant means that actually that's money coming in that you can use at your discretion. So if you want to use that on your core costs, you can. If you want to develop a service, you can. That's the kind of money that you want to bring in to cover your core costs. So you can use our funder finder, and I've also got a list which I will send out to you afterwards, and they include things like the Lloyds Bank Foundation, Garfield Weston Foundation, Paul Hamlin Foundation, Tudor Trust, Henry Smith, John Ellerman. So they all tend to be the trusts and foundations rather than the big kind of statutory body funders that are more inclined to fund those core costs. Definitely worth having a look. And actually it might just be a really small amount to start with, but once you can get in and build those relationships with those funders, then you can really put your case across. And so it can be really a good way to get your foot in the door. And what you're really doing when you're going for this grant is emphasizing the ultimate benefit to service users. So actually, if you can cover the costs of your back end of your back office costs, or in fact, you know, things like we did with our CRM, that the benefits that come from that ultimately benefit the end user. So it's about pushing that forward. If you see a funder that you're not sure about, just check the criteria, or I always encourage people to give them a call. I don't think they always want us to give them a call, but I always do it anyway. So give them a call and just have a chat and just sound them out about it and see if that's something they will do. So if you do identify some of the funders, it's about communicating how those core costs really make a difference to beneficiaries and demonstrating how you align with the funders' objectives or their thematic areas of focus that can help you make that case. So when I was having a quick look for different funders that fund core costs, I actually came across Esme Fairbairn, who I'm sure you've all heard of, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. They've been very supportive of us in the past with our core costs, actually. And in one of their reports, I found this. Now, this might be really tiny on your screen, so I will send this to you afterwards. But what it actually talks about is how core funding makes a difference to all of these different areas. So this is a really useful document that I think could be beneficial to anybody that wants to put in a core cost funding grant bid, because there's some really good things that you can pick up from here about how you can relate how core costs make a difference to all of these different areas. So definitely worth to take a look on this, but this is really encouraging because this is one of a couple of funders that are really seeing the value in funding charitable core costs and back office costs. They're not really easy to sell, so if we can find a funder that wants to do that, I suggest we make the most of them and really learn from the way that they are doing things. So right now I want to have a look at the key methods of funding core costs. So this is basically how several different methods at which you can use to cover the core costs. So we're going to look at basic budgeting, we're going to look at full cost recovery, project repackaging, unit costing, and diversifying income. These are all very sexy topics, you will see. So I will try to make them quite interesting, although I can't promise anything. Now, this is just an introduction. I would say that in our resources library, if you sign into our website on your membership dashboard, you can access quite a lot of different stuff, certainly around full cost recovery and diversifying income. So do go into that section and have a nosy around for a lot more information than I'm able to give you in an hour. So let's look first at basic budgeting. I'm so glad this is the webinar I've decided to record when it turns out I can't really get my words out. So basic budgeting is basic. It is what it sounds like. It's where we calculate between 10 and 20% of the total project cost and add this in for our overheads. So this is when you're applying for a grant for a project. This is how you can put your kind of full cost, your core costs in with that bid. So when you choose what your kind of percentage is going to be, you need to be able to explain that that's an overhead. So in a project line, you might well have an overhead budget line. That's where you put that amount. And then you would put that includes office costs, management time, finance and admin. So for example, if the total cost of the project is £10,000, you would add your 12%, for example, in the overhead line, and it would be 1,200. It's not the most accurate way of showing core costs and running costs. So some funders really aren't keen on this kind of arbitrary percentage, but it is a really simple way of including your core costs within a project application. It's quite common among kind of CVS organisations. Some funders really will accept this. And it is a kind of quick and dirty way of just kind of working it out. You do need to be able to break it down though. You can't just arbitrarily say 15%. So if a funder comes back to you and they want to know, you have to be prepared to kind of break that down and make sure that you can justify the amount. So it's not a perfect solution, but actually it kind of is a partial answer for many charities moving forward as to how they can cover their core costs in project funding. Next, we look briefly at full cost recovery. This might be something that some of you are familiar with. So this is an accounting-led approach where all the core costs of an organisation are allocated across the entirety of all the projects. So based on, for example, how many staff are involved in delivering each of the projects. I'll give you an example of this in a second. The benefits of this is that it can cover all of your core costs. However, it makes some of them look really expensive for some reason. So it also really requires a good, solid finance and admin system to calculate and allocate and explain and be transparent. So you could literally calculate every single penny that a project actually costs you and include them in your full cost recovery. I put here that it's a simple way of knowing the overall sum of your core costs and then dividing them by a figure. This, I always think, full cost recovery is not that easy to explain, and it's always worked better in theory than it does tend to in practice. As I say, we've got some resources in our library which go into much more detail about full cost recovery, but I have got a really super basic example of how it kind of works here. So your total overheads are 20,000. You are putting in a project bid for like, I don't know, 100,000 over 2 years. You've got 4 projects across the organisation. So each of those 4 projects is going to carry £5,000 of overhead cost. So in this bid that you're putting in for 100,000, you would include 5,000 for your overheads for your bid. And hopefully you would have 4 other bids that you're putting in, which would then cover the whole of it. Or the other example that we've got here is your total overheads are 20,000 and you have 5 full-time staff. Each staff member therefore carries £4,000 worth of overheads. So if you have 2 staff, you would allocate to your project an overhead sum of 8,000. So hopefully those 2 examples and they are very basic examples of how full cost recovery could work. But yeah, it's about working out how much running a project actually costs you, because one thing we were very keen to do last year when we took on the role of funder and gave out grants was to make sure that no group that got grant funding from us was left in a worse situation after they had that grant than they were before. So it's about making sure that all of the costs can be covered by that project funding. So full cost recovery. It's a method generally favoured by the public sector. So actually it's a really good way of calculating your costs if you're making tenders to a local authority, health authorities, or for research funders, they tend to use it as well. Some larger trusts and foundations will accept full cost recovery if they're willing in the first place, of course, to cover overheads. You need to be transparent and you need to be consistent. Bear in mind that some funders will think that you're trying to get them to pay for costs that aren't directly related to the project. So you need to explain why you're using that system and how you've worked it out. So yeah, just be prepared to explain it. And if you are going to use full cost recovery, be consistent. Use the same method in all of your funding bids. Don't chop and change amounts or the method you've used to work out that full cost recovery cost, because you're going to get confused and it's not going to help with you being transparent as a charity. So the next method I'm going to look at is repackaging up your core costs as a project. This one sounds brilliant, but it can be slightly harder to do. So when is a core cost not a core cost? When it's a project. So some core costs can be redefined and repackaged as projects in their own right, and funding sought for them in the form of a grant. You do have to find the right funder, and I've given you a couple of examples here. So salary for a trainer could be packaged up into a training project that you want to apply for. A CRM system, that was one that we managed to do. New website, another one that we managed to do. And so this is the other example, which I think is quite good, because your AGM is absolutely something you have to do if you're a registered charity, and even if you're not a registered charity, you should still be doing this as part of your governing document, lays it out, and actually that's part of a core cost. But what we do is we always put our AGM on the end of a day-long conference, and then we try and get funding or sponsorship to host that day-long conference. So actually we're kind of packaging it up as a project rather than as a core cost. You've got to be quite creative here, and actually really kind of have a look at some of your budget headings, really kind of look at whether you can take them out of the core costs and package them up so that they can be their own project. And you've got to make a really good case for that as well. It's not always the easiest thing to do, but definitely something worth thinking about if you haven't already kind of done that. The next one was unit costing. Unit costing is another effective approach to identify all the costs of an operational project and then work out some handy costs, such as the cost per client or how much it costs a day or a month to run the organisation. And a few minutes with the calculator is all it takes to work out a couple of different ones, and then really choose the unit cost that sounds like the best value for money and build them into any public appeals that you might be having. It's a really flexible approach and can allow you to kind of really chop and change for the audience. So for example, when we ask for donations on our website, what we actually do is say, if you donated £100, that's actually going to mean that one of our smaller members can come to our annual conference and their travel can be covered. Or it could be that actually we're running a training program, and if you donate £50, that means 2 groups can take part in 5 webinars. That's just an example, but it's also quite nifty because it can be multiplied to make it larger appeals. So you could say a £5,000 donation means that 25 groups get a subsidised membership with consortium because they need that to access that support but can't afford it. So it's quite a nice way of covering core costs. It's quite a neat and tidy one and can really work, certainly when you're trying to appeal to individual donors for unrestricted money. So that's money that can go right into your core costs, rather than to say, can you help us run an event or a project? So it's quite a nice, neat little easy way to kind of pick a sum and make it really easy for people to understand how that's contributing to what you're doing. And so the other, I kind of called a method, but actually it's lots of different methods, and it's simply about diversifying your income. So it can be quite hard when you've only got project funding coming in to really be covering your core costs from all of those little different projects, especially if they're not large amounts of money. So really it's about encouraging groups to really look elsewhere to cover their core costs. So individual giving, we were just looking at that unit costing. That can be a really great way to engage individual donors. Community fundraising, actually, if you are fundraising at an event or you're getting groups to fundraise, actually that is money that can be used for unrestricted funding, as long as you're not promising the people that are donating or raising that money for you that it's going to a specific thing. Crowdfunding, again, general appeals through crowdfunding can bring in quite good unrestricted money. Running events, selling training, legacies, which are a bit harder to kind of work out, but if anybody's interested in that, certainly we can provide you with some more resources and maybe even hook you up with a couple of other larger members that are really being quite successful in securing legacy donations. So it's about looking at where you are bringing in money now, what you can turn into a sellable thing. So for anybody that's delivering training, can that money come in? Is there anything left over from paying the trainer that can go into the core costs? So really it's about looking at how we're being clever with bringing that money in. One of the things I will say as well is when you're choosing lots of different ways to diversify your income, to start small and experiment. So don't leap into suddenly deciding that you're going to do legacies. The thing about legacies is that it takes a lot of time to build relationships, to build to put the legacies in place, and then of course it's not instant money, because you know that might be 10 or 20 years down the line, hopefully longer for lots of people. So it's about trying lots of different things and experimenting with which kinds of income are more successful. You might try community fundraising, but actually find that it's only successful when you put an actual project that people can donate to, rather than just organizational core costs or the organization. Be strategic. If you're going to diversify your income in this way, build it into your fundraising strategy. If any of you haven't got a fundraising strategy, I would definitely recommend developing one. It can be one side of A4 piece of paper. It doesn't have to be some kind of flashy document, but it's really about looking ahead at the next 12 to 18 to 2 years to really look at where the money is coming in, who you're going to be applying to, and what you really need. Once you decide to start with one of these methods, use it for at least 12 months and then review it. Don't just try it for a month, chop and change. Really give them a go and see if they are working for you. And then review it, try something new, or continue with the way that you're doing it if it's working. As I say, Consortium has a range of resources on all of these methods, so that you can start really looking at the different things that are going to work for you. So really, that is kind of, didn't quite last an hour, but actually that's kind of it. So it's really over to you. So what I'm challenging you to do is to go away and work out your core costs, really get familiar with your core costs. It doesn't sound like an exciting afternoon, but actually it's a really useful way to get to grips with what you need, what can be packaged up as a project, what's urgent, what's being funded now, what's going to run out. Really get familiar with it. Don't be afraid to negotiate with different services that you already have, and look at whether you're getting the best value for money. Give it a go. Try some of the options that we've introduced here. Try and see if you can come up with some interesting unit costs. Look at how full cost recovery might work for you in practice. Use our resources library to get a bit more au fait with some of the things that I've talked about. And as I say, if you haven't already, really consider this approach in your fundraising plan. We do actually have a toolkit which helps you develop a fundraising plan. If anybody's interested, please get in touch with me. I'll be really happy to share. So for like trying and be silent for like a minute. Well, if any of you have got any question, you can either type question into the chat bar, or you can type your question into the chat bar. I can either unmute you or read your question aloud and see if I'm able to answer it.